London, May 1945. Victory bells had rung across the city just days before, but the celebration felt hollow against the backdrop of devastation. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, skeletal remains of buildings reaching toward gray skies like broken fingers. Yet amid the rubble, life persisted with stubborn determination. Children played hopscotch over crater-filled streets, market vendors hawked their meager wares from makeshift stalls, and double-decker buses navigated obstacle courses of debris with practiced ease. The war in Europe was over, but its aftermath presented challenges no one had fully anticipated. Scattered across the British Isles were more than 400,000 German prisoners of war, housed in over 600 camps from the Scottish Highlands to the Cornish coast. These men, once the feared Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, now found themselves under the guardianship of a nation they had been taught to despise. Unlike the brutal treatment meted out in other theaters of war, Britain adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions. The prisoners were provided adequate shelter, nutritious meals, and medical care. More importantly, they were put to work. With millions of British men still demobilizing from overseas service, there was a critical labor shortage. German POWs filled the gap, working on farms, repairing bomb damage, and even assisting in coal mines. This wasn't mere charity. It was practical necessity wrapped in humanitarian principle. But the British government understood that physical sustenance alone wouldn't suffice. These men had been indoctrinated by one of history's most effective propaganda machines. Their minds had been shaped by years of Nazi ideology, their worldview distorted by carefully crafted lies about British society, democracy, and the nature of their enemies. Simply feeding and housing them until repatriation would accomplish nothing. They needed to be prepared for return to a Germany that would, hopefully, embrace democratic values. Thus was born the Re-Education Program, a comprehensive effort to denazify the prisoners and instill democratic principles. Lectures were organized covering everything from parliamentary democracy to the horrors of the Holocaust. Films depicting concentration camp atrocities were screened, forcing the men to confront the reality of the regime they had served. Discussion groups encouraged critical thinking, allowing prisoners to voice doubts and question long-held beliefs. The program's architects recognized that intellectual arguments alone might not penetrate years of conditioning. What was needed was experiential learning, controlled exposure to British civilian life that would demonstrate the falsehood of Nazi propaganda about British society. If these men could see for themselves that Britons weren't the degenerate, money-obsessed weaklings described in Goebbels' broadcasts, it might crack the foundation of their ideological certainty. The selection process for these experimental interactions was meticulous. Not every prisoner was suitable. Military psychologists evaluated each candidate, looking for signs of genuine remorse, evidence of questioning Nazi doctrine, or simply the intellectual flexibility to absorb new perspectives. They sought men who might serve as conduits for change when they eventually returned to Germany. Among those selected were three men whose stories would become emblematic of the program's potential. Hans Müller, 35, had been captured during the Normandy invasion in June 1944. A former infantryman from Bavaria, he had left behind a wife and 2 young children. For 10 months he had worked on British farms, his letters home describing a homeland in ruins while he harvested crops in the English countryside. The contradiction wasn't lost on him. Klaus Weber, 28, had been shot down over Kent in 1943 while serving as a Luftwaffe mechanic. He had been in British custody longer than most, witnessing firsthand the resilience of the British people during the Blitz. From his camp he had seen London burning in the distance, yet the next morning buses ran on time and shopkeepers opened their doors. This wasn't the brittle society Nazi propaganda had described. Friedrich Schmidt was the youngest at 19, a conscript from Hamburg captured in Holland. Unlike his older companions, Friedrich had no adult memories of life before the war. His entire worldview had been shaped by Nazi education and propaganda. The Re-Education Program was his first exposure to alternative perspectives, and he struggled with the cognitive dissonance between what he had been taught and what he now observed. On a gray Tuesday morning in late May, these 3 men and 9 others were informed they would be leaving camp for a special assignment. No details were provided, only that they should conduct themselves with dignity and remember they represented their fellow prisoners. They were issued clean uniforms marked with the letters PW and loaded into the back of a military truck. The journey from their camp in Surrey to central London took 2 hours, winding through countryside still scarred by war, but showing signs of recovery. The prisoners sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts as they watched the landscape roll past. They saw bomb craters filled with wildflowers, temporary bridges spanning damaged railways, and everywhere the evidence of a nation rebuilding itself with quiet determination. As they entered London's outskirts, the devastation became more apparent. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, their remains bulldozed into neat piles awaiting removal. Yet between the ruins, life continued. Children walked to school past bombed-out churches, their uniforms clean and their faces bright with curiosity rather than fear. Women queued patiently outside shops, their ration books clutched in gloved hands, chatting pleasantly despite the hardships they faced. The truck navigated streets that seemed to have been drawn by a madman's hand, zigzagging around obstacles and following detours that had become permanent fixtures. Double-decker buses, their red paint faded but spirits undaunted, carried passengers through this urban maze with practiced efficiency. The prisoners watched in fascination as conductors called out stops and passengers disembarked with polite thank yous and good mornings. Hans found himself thinking of Munich, wondering if his own city showed such resilience in the face of destruction. The letters from his wife spoke of hunger and cold, of buildings reduced to rubble and neighbors who had simply vanished. Yet here, in the heart of the enemy capital, he saw something that defied explanation. Not the broken, demoralized population Nazi propaganda had promised, but a people who seemed almost cheerfully determined to carry on. Klaus, with his longer experience of British captivity, wasn't surprised by what he saw. He had learned to read the subtle signs of British character during his 2 years of imprisonment. The way guards said please when giving orders, the careful attention to fairness in work assignments, the genuine concern shown when prisoners fell ill. This wasn't the behavior of a morally bankrupt society, despite what his former commanders had claimed. Friedrich stared wide-eyed at everything, his young mind struggling to process images that contradicted everything he had been taught. Where were the signs of social collapse? Where was the evidence of the moral degeneracy that Nazi educators had described in such vivid detail? Instead, he saw orderly cues, polite interactions, and a society that functioned despite having endured years of bombardment. The truck finally came to a halt outside a building that seemed to have stepped from another era. The King's Head was a traditional Victorian pub, its brick facade adorned with hanging flower baskets that somehow managed to bloom despite the surrounding devastation. A painted sign depicted a regal figure holding a tankard. The colors faded, but the image still proud and welcoming. The prisoners were ushered out of the truck, their boots crunching on glass fragments that still littered the pavement from some long-ago bombing raid. British soldiers took positions around the building, not as guards exactly, but as observers. This was an experiment after all, and every reaction would be noted and analyzed. The heavy wooden door of the pub creaked as it swung open, revealing an interior that seemed untouched by the war raging outside. Dark wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and the walls were adorned with faded photographs and memorabilia from decades past. The air was thick with the scent of ale and tobacco, creating an atmosphere of timeless comfort. The patrons, a mix of local residents and off-duty workers, turned to observe the newcomers. Conversations faltered, glasses paused halfway to lips, and the usual hum of pub chatter died away. The presence of German soldiers, even as prisoners, was an intrusion into this sanctuary of normalcy. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed barely concealed hostility. Behind the bar stood George Thompson, a man whose 63 years showed in every line of his weathered face. He had been the proprietor of the King's Head for over 4 decades, serving pints through 2 wars and countless smaller crises. His hands, scarred from years of handling broken glass and heavy barrels, moved with practiced efficiency as he polished a tankard. George's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. He recognized the uniforms, understood the implications of their presence. For a moment his hand tightened on the glass he was cleaning, and his jaw clenched with barely suppressed emotion. His only son, Lieutenant James Thompson of the Royal Sussex Regiment, had died at Monte Cassino in 1944. The telegram still sat in his kitchen drawer, its words burned into his memory. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the prisoners stood uncertainly near the entrance. They had expected many things, but not this. Not the warm lighting, the comfortable furnishings, the sense of community that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. This was exactly the kind of establishment Nazi propaganda had claimed didn't exist in Britain, where supposedly all social interaction was cold, commercial, and devoid of genuine human warmth. George set down his glass and reached for a row of clean pint glasses. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he positioned each glass under the beer tap. The amber liquid flowed steadily, foam rising to create perfect heads on each pint. The sound of beer hitting glass was the only noise in the suddenly quiet pub. When he had filled 12 glasses, George arranged them on the bar with careful precision. He looked up at the prisoners, his expression unreadable, then spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the room. "Here you go, lads. First one's on the house." The words hit the prisoners like a physical blow. They had prepared themselves for hostility, for rejection, perhaps even for violence. Instead, they were being offered hospitality by a man who had every reason to hate them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Hans was the first to move, stepping forward on unsteady legs. He reached for one of the glasses, the coolness of it surprising against his palm. The foam tickled his nose as he lifted it, and for a moment he was transported back to his local tavern in Bavaria, 2 evenings spent with friends before the war changed everything. One by one, the other prisoners followed suit, each accepting a glass with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. They moved to tables scattered around the pub, their movements careful and respectful. The weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. For several minutes, the prisoners simply sat in silence, staring at their untouched pints. The beer represented more than refreshment. It was a symbol of normalcy, of the civilian life they had left behind and might never reclaim. Some had not tasted alcohol since their capture, others not since before the war began. The simple act of being served a drink in a pub, of being treated as customers rather than prisoners, was profoundly disarming. Klaus found himself remembering the guest house near his family's home in Cologne, where his father had taken him for his first legal beer on his 18th birthday. The pride in his father's eyes, the sense of joining the adult world, the taste of freedom and possibility. Now, thousands of miles from home and wearing the uniform of a defeated army, he was being offered that same dignity by former enemies. Friedrich had never experienced pub culture, even in Germany. His youth had been consumed by Hitler Youth activities and military training. This was his first time in such an establishment, and he was overwhelmed by the atmosphere of casual camaraderie. The easy conversation between strangers, the shared laughter, the sense of community that seemed to flow as freely as the beer itself. George watched them from behind the bar, his expression softening slightly. He had made his decision in that moment when he chose to serve them, but now he was seeing the full impact of his gesture. These weren't the fanatical monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were young men, far from home, struggling with the weight of defeat and uncertainty about their futures. The silence was finally broken by Arthur Whitman, a middle-aged docker who had been nursing his pint in the corner. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and walked over to the table where Hans sat with 2 other prisoners. "Mind if I join you?" Arthur asked, his East London accent thick, but his tone friendly. The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances before Hans nodded. Arthur pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, setting his pint on the table with a solid thunk. "Name's Arthur," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Lost my brother Tommy in France last year. He was about your age, I reckon." Hans took the offered hand, shaking it firmly. "Hans Müller, I'm sorry for your loss." Arthur nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "War's a bloody awful thing, innit? Takes the best of us and leaves the rest to figure out what comes next." The conversation that followed was halting at first, limited by language barriers and the weight of recent enmity. But gradually, tentatively, the barriers began to crumble. Arthur spoke of his brother, a cheerful lad who had wanted to be a teacher before the war consumed his generation. Hans shared memories of his own family, of children who barely remembered their father, and a wife struggling to survive in a bombed-out city. At another table, Klaus found himself in conversation with Margaret Sullivan, a widow whose husband had died in the Battle of Britain. She had come to the pub for her weekly half-pint and quiet moment of remembrance, but found herself drawn into dialogue with the young German, who reminded her painfully of her lost spouse. "He was a mechanic too," she said quietly, studying Klaus's face. Always had grease under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. Used to joke that he was part machine himself. Klaus nodded, understanding more from her tone than her words. I worked on Messerschmitts, he said carefully. Perhaps we fixed planes that fought each other. Margaret smiled sadly. Perhaps. But you're both just boys who knew how to fix things. Shame the world gave you such different things to fix. Friedrich meanwhile sat largely silent, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions swirling around him. He had been taught that British civilians were weak, corrupted by democracy and Jewish influence. Yet here he saw strength of a different kind. Not the rigid militaristic strength he had been trained to admire, but something more flexible and enduring. These people had endured years of bombing, rationing, and loss, yet they maintained their humanity, their capacity for kindness even toward former enemies. George moved among the tables, refilling glasses and facilitating conversations with the skill of a man who had spent decades managing the delicate social ecosystem of a neighborhood pub. He had seen the healing power of shared drinks and honest conversation, had watched strangers become friends over pints and problems dissolve in the warm glow of human connection. As the evening progressed, the initial tension gave way to something approaching normalcy. The prisoners were no longer objects of curiosity or suspicion, but participants in the ancient ritual of pub conversation. Stories were shared, jokes translated, and gradually the artificial barriers of nationality and ideology began to dissolve. Hans found himself describing his work on British farms, the kindness of the farmers who had employed him, the strange experience of harvesting food for people he had been trained to consider enemies. Arthur listened with growing amazement as Hans described the careful fairness of his treatment, the way disputes were resolved through discussion rather than force, the genuine concern shown for prisoners' welfare. Blimey, Arthur said, shaking his head. Sounds like you lot got treated better than some of our own boys in the army. The comment drew laughter from both sides of the table, but it also highlighted a profound truth. The British approach to prisoner management wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategically brilliant. By treating captured enemies with dignity and fairness, they were creating ambassadors for democratic values who would return to Germany with first-hand experience of how a free society functioned. Klaus shared his observations of British resilience during the Blitz, describing nights when the sky rained fire yet morning brought the same orderly cues, the same polite interactions, the same determination to carry on. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes, remembering those terrible nights when she had huddled in underground stations, wondering if her world would still exist when dawn came. We never talked about giving up, she said quietly. Not really. Oh, we complained about the rationing and the blackouts and the constant fear. But giving up? That wasn't British. The phrase struck Klaus with particular force. That wasn't British. It suggested a national character that transcended government or ideology, something deeper and more enduring than political systems. This was what Nazi propaganda had failed to understand about their enemies. They had assumed that democracy meant weakness, that freedom meant chaos. Instead, Klaus was seeing that democracy could be a source of strength, that freedom could create bonds stronger than those forged by fear. Friedrich, still struggling with the gap between his expectations and reality, finally found his voice. In school, they told us that British people had no culture, no traditions, that democracy had destroyed everything noble in your society. George, who had been listening from behind the bar, let out a bark of laughter. No culture? Son, this pub is older than your entire country. We've been pulling pints and solving the world's problems in places like this for centuries. Democracy didn't destroy our traditions. It preserved them by making them belong to everyone, not just the toffs. The observation sparked a broader discussion about the nature of tradition and culture. The British patrons described their customs, their ceremonies, their sense of continuity stretching back through generations. But unlike the rigid militaristic traditions Friedrich had been taught to revere, these were living, breathing customs that adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential character. As closing time approached, George made an announcement that surprised everyone. Right then, last orders. But before you lads head back, I want to say something. He paused, his weathered hands gripping the bar. My boy died fighting your lot. Could have been any one of you that pulled the trigger. But sitting here tonight, listening to you talk about your families, your hopes, your fears, well, you're not monsters. You're just men who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves. He reached under the bar and pulled out a photograph. its edges worn from handling. It showed a young man in British Army uniform, his smile bright and confident. This was my James. 22 years old, wanted to be a teacher when the war ended, died at Monte Cassino trying to free Italy from fascism. The pub fell silent as George continued. I could hate you for that. Part of me wants to. But James wouldn't want that. He believed in something better, something worth fighting for. And that something includes the idea that former enemies can become friends, that wars end but humanity endures. Hans stood up slowly, his untouched pint still in his hand. Mr. Thompson, I cannot give you back your son. I cannot undo the war or the pain it has caused. But I can promise you this. When I return to Germany, I will tell everyone about this night, about your kindness, about the dignity you have shown us. Perhaps that is how we honor the memory of all the young men who died, British and German alike. The words hung in the air like a benediction. George nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. That'll do, son. That'll do. The prisoners finished their drinks in contemplative silence, each processing the evening's revelations in his own way. They had entered the pub as defeated enemies, expecting hostility, or at best, cold tolerance. Instead, they had experienced something that challenged every assumption they had held about their captors and themselves. As they prepared to leave, several of the British patrons shook hands with the prisoners, exchanging addresses and promises to write. Arthur pressed a small photograph into Hans's hand, a picture of his brother Tommy in uniform. So you remember, he said simply. So you remember that we're all somebody's brother, somebody's son. The journey back to camp was subdued, each prisoner lost in his own thoughts. The London streets, which had seemed foreign and hostile just hours before, now felt different. They were still in enemy territory, still prisoners of war, but the nature of that imprisonment had fundamentally changed. They were no longer captives of a vengeful enemy, but guests of a nation confident enough in its values to extend hospitality even to those who had fought against it. Back at the camp, word of the evening spread quickly through the barracks. Some prisoners listened with skepticism, others with fascination. The story of the night at the King's Head became a symbol, a testament to the possibility of reconciliation even in the darkest of times. For Hans, the evening marked the beginning of a transformation that would shape the rest of his life. When he was finally repatriated to Germany in 1947, he carried with him not just memories of British kindness, but a deep understanding of democratic values. He became a teacher in post-war Bavaria, dedicating his life to educating young Germans about the importance of tolerance, dialogue, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Klaus maintained correspondence with several of the people he had met that night, including Margaret Sullivan. Their letters, carefully censored by military authorities, became small bridges across the chasm of recent enmity. When travel restrictions were finally lifted in the 1950s, Klaus returned to London as a tourist, visiting the King's Head and renewing friendships forged in the aftermath of war. Friedrich's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The young man who had entered the pub as a product of Nazi indoctrination emerged as someone capable of questioning authority and thinking independently. He would eventually immigrate to Britain in the 1950s, building a successful life as a translator and becoming a British citizen. He often said that his real education began not in a classroom, but in a London pub over a pint of bitter. George Thompson continued to serve pints at the King's Head until his retirement in 1962. He never spoke publicly about that evening in May 1945, but regular patrons noticed that he always kept a photograph of his son James behind the bar, next to a small German beer stein that had been sent to him by Hans Müller as a Christmas gift in 1947. The re-education program that had sponsored that evening proved remarkably successful. Studies conducted in the 1950s showed that German POWs who had participated in civilian interaction programs were significantly more likely to embrace democratic values upon repatriation. They became teachers, civil servants, and community leaders in the new Federal Republic of Germany, carrying with them first-hand knowledge of how democracy functioned in practice. The evening at the King's Head became part of a larger pattern of successful prisoner rehabilitation that would influence international law and military doctrine for decades to come. The British approach, emphasizing dignity, fairness, and gradual reintegration, stood in stark contrast to the vengeful treatment of prisoners in other conflicts. It demonstrated that former enemies could indeed become allies, that the cycle of hatred and revenge could be broken through simple human decency. In the grand sweep of history, that May evening in a London pub was just one small moment among millions, but it embodied something profound about the nature of reconciliation and the power of treating enemies as human beings rather than monsters. The silence that fell over those 12 German prisoners when they were served their first pint since capture was not just surprise or gratitude. It was the sound of assumptions crumbling, of prejudices dissolving, of humanity reasserting itself over ideology. Years later, when the European Union was formed and former enemies became partners in peace, observers would point to many factors that made such cooperation possible. Economic necessity, political pragmatism, and strategic calculations all played their part. But perhaps equally important were countless small moments of human connection, times when former enemies discovered their shared humanity over simple gestures of kindness. The pints served that night at the King's Head were more than beer. They were symbols of a different way of thinking about conflict and its aftermath. They represented the radical idea that victory could be magnanimous, that strength could be shown through mercy, and that the best way to defeat an enemy might be to turn him into a friend. In a world still scarred by war and division, that lesson remains as relevant today as it was in that London pub in May 1945. The silence of those German prisoners, broken finally by conversation and laughter, reminds us that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail over hatred, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against extremism is simply treating people with dignity and respect. The war was over, but the peace was just beginning. And in a small pub in London, over pints of bitter and halting conversation, former enemies took the first tentative steps toward becoming friends. It was a quiet revolution, fought not with weapons but with words, won not through conquest but through compassion, and in that victory perhaps lay the seeds of a better world. If this story of unexpected humanity in the darkest of times moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that reveal the power of human decency, even in war. Not subscribed yet? Hit that like button if you found this tale of German POWs and British hospitality as powerful as we did, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how small acts of kindness can change the course of history. What other moments of unexpected humanity during wartime do you think deserve to be told? Share your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the human stories behind history's greatest conflicts. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten moments of compassion to light. Subscribe, like, and comment, because these stories of hope matter now more than ever.